Welcome to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're really diving deep into Bertrand Russell's huge work, History of Western Philosophy. Specifically, we're focusing on that foundational stretch, ancient Greek thought right up to the early Christian era. Our goal here is to pull out the core ideas, maybe find some surprising links, and really grasp the lasting impact of these philosophies. Think of it as getting the essentials from Russell's perspective. We'll be looking at the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle, those Hellenistic schools, and how philosophy sort of set the stage for early Christianity.
Absolutely. And Russell really kicks things off by setting a frame. He points to Descartes as, a kind of starting point for modern philosophy. It's that shift towards subjectivism he emphasizes.
The focus on the I think.
Exactly. Making subjective experience the bedrock for understanding reality. Russell sees this as the beginning of a trend. He traces it through later thinkers, even suggesting it reaches a sort of peak with Socrates' intense ego focus. Russell's take is quite critical, actually. He suggests a lot of philosophy after Descartes is sort of trying to claw its way back to common sense reality.
And it's fascinating how he connects that philosophical idea, subjectivism, to something really concrete like political movements. Anarchism, specifically.
Right, he does. He brings up the Anabaptists of Minster back in the 16th century. Their whole thing was direct divine guidance for each person.
So no need for human laws.
Precisely. If you're truly spiritual, you'll just be good, was the idea. Russell notes this led them to, communal living, rejecting traditional structures, before they were eventually suppressed.
But the core idea didn't just disappear.
No, he argues it spread in softer forms. You see it influencing groups like the Quakers in Holland, England, America, that emphasis on individual spiritual authority. And then Russell draws a line, a connection to the more secular anarchism later on, 19th century Russia, Spain, Italy. The target shifts from religious authority to the state, but the root idea, the rejection of external constraints based on individual insight, is similar in his view.
That's a really provocative link he makes there.
It is. He's always weaving intellectual threads with social ones. Now, turning to the very beginnings in Greece, the pre-Socratics, Russell paints them with such energy. He stresses their mix of, what we'd now call mysticism and early science.
The kind of zest of children, I think he calls it.
Yes, this imaginative vigor trying to explain everything. Meteors, morality, the whole cosmos. It was a wide-open inquiry.
But then Russell sees a shift, doesn't he? A sort of narrowing of focus that maybe led to a dip in that initial energy.
He does suggest that. It starts, perhaps, with the sophists. Their focus shifts more towards rhetoric, persuasion, how we argue, rather than just discovering objective truth.
And then Socrates.
Socrates comes along, intensely focused on ethics, what is justice, what is virtue. Then Plato, turning towards that abstract realm of forms, kind of away from the sensory world. And Aristotle, with his systematic approach, focusing on purpose, on teleology.
So, while obviously acknowledging their immense importance.
Immense, yes.
Russell feels there's maybe an undue emphasis on man compared with the universe, a loss of that cosmic scale.
That's his assessment. He argues that after these giants, philosophical vigor sort of decays for a time. Popular beliefs, maybe more superstitious ones, resurface. It's not until the Renaissance, in Russell's view, that philosophy really recaptures that bold, independent spirit of the earliest Greeks.
Okay, let's dig into some of those pre-Socratics then. Heraclitus, for instance.
Heraclitus, the philosopher of flux. Everything is constantly changing.
You can't step into the same river twice.
That's the one. He saw fire as the fundamental element, always transforming. Existence for him comes from this tension, this interplay of opposites.
Like life from death.
Exactly. Things are born from the death of other things. He saw a unity in this opposition, this constant becoming, and this underlying principle, this one, he even identified with God. It's a very dynamic view of reality.
And then you get Parmenides, who seems like the complete opposite.
Diametrically opposed, really. Parmenides argued for a reality that is static, unchanging, one. Russell points out his key assumption that the meaning of words must be constant.
How does Russell critique that?
Well, he uses the example of, say, George Washington. The word George Washington means something different, evokes different mental processes for someone who knew him versus someone hearing the name centuries later.
So the subjective experience tied to the word changes.
Precisely. Russell argues this variability undermines Parmenides' core assumption about fixed meaning, and therefore his conclusion about an unchanging reality.
What about Empedocles? Russell portrays him as quite a character.
Oh, absolutely. Empedocles is fascinating. Russell describes him as this mix: philosopher, prophet, scientist, even a bit of a charlatan. He lived around 440 BC, involved in democratic politics in Sicily, Acragas.
And he claimed to be divine.
He did, apparently. Russell notes the political turbulence of Sicily at the time, democracies, tyrannies flipping back and forth, exile was common, and Empedocles himself was exiled. After that, he seems to have shifted more towards prophecy.
Russell suggests maybe an Orphic influence?
Possibly, yes. Especially given the religious elements that come through. His life really shows how intertwined philosophy, politics, science, and religion could be back then.
Right, those clear dividing lines we have now just weren't there.
Not in the same way.
Okay, let's talk about Pythagoras, a huge figure.
Definitely. Russell tells the story of him leaving Samos, apparently didn't like the ruler, Polycrates, and setting up shop in Croton, southern Italy. Croton was a big deal, a wealthy Greek city known for trade and, interestingly, for medicine.
He mentions Democedes, the physician.
Yes, who served powerful figures like Polycrates and Darius of Persia. Shows Croton's reputation. Croton also had links to Miletus, another philosophical hotspot, and famously destroyed its rival, Sybaris.
But Pythagoras wasn't just about politics or trade. There's the whole mystical side.
Absolutely central. Russell really emphasizes the Orphic connection. He talks about those gold tablets found in tombs, like the Petilia tablet.
The ones giving instructions to the soul.
Exactly. Guidance for the afterlife, how to navigate the underworld, achieve salvation, mention becoming a Bacchus. It points to a deep belief in reincarnation, purification, ideas very strong in Orphism and Pythagoreanism.
So more than just triangles.
Oh, much more. It was a whole way of life, ethical, religious, mathematical, all woven together.
Russell also takes a moment to discuss the concept of space and the void. Long-running debate.
Yes, briefly but significantly. He contrasts Newton's idea of absolute space, like an empty container, with Descartes, who saw space just as a property of extended things.
And Leibniz.
Leibniz had a relational view. Space is just the relationships between things. Then Russell brings it forward to Einstein. Relativity changes the game.
Distance becomes about events in space-time.
Right, a four-dimensional continuum. And this, Russell notes, really challenges the old idea of a simple, empty void. It's more complex, involving time and causality.
Okay, moving towards Athens now. The Sophists and then Socrates.
The Sophists first. Russell positions them as shifting the focus. Less cosmology, more practical skills. Rhetoric, argumentation, how to persuade, how we know rather than what we know, perhaps.
Leading to a degree of skepticism.
Yes, questioning whether absolute truth is even attainable or maybe just less important than effective communication.
And then Socrates. Russell gives context for his trial, Athens after the war.
Exactly. Athens in 399 BC, still recovering from the Peloponnesian War. There was an amnesty, but tensions were high. Socrates had associations with some unpopular figures from the recent oligarchic regime, the 30 Tyrants. Some were his students.
Making him suspect in the restored democracy.
It seems likely. The charges were impiety, not worshipping state gods, introducing new ones and corrupting the youth. The Anytus, Miletus, Lycon brought the case.
Russell relies heavily on Plato's account, especially the apology rite.
He does, acknowledging the difficulty of separating the historical Socrates from Plato's portrayal. But Plato's Socrates strongly emphasizes his focus on ethics over science. I have nothing to do with physical speculations, he says.
And those early dialogues.
The early Platonic dialogues, often seen as closest to the real Socrates, constantly wrestle with defining ethical terms. Temperance in Charmides, friendship in Lysis, courage in Laches, and they often end inconclusively, highlighting the Socratic method of questioning, the process of ethical inquiry.
Russell also sees foreshadowing in Socrates of later schools like Stoicism and Cynicism.
Definitely. The Stoic idea that virtue is the only true good, and that external events can't really harm a virtuous person, that resonates strongly with Socrates' defense in the Apology. He tells the jury they can kill him, but they can't harm him.
And the Cynic side.
The Cynic rejection of material possessions, comforts, societal norms. You see echoes in Socrates' own simple lifestyle. Barefoot, plain clothes. He lived his philosophy.
So he really laid the groundwork for those later ethical traditions.
He provided a powerful model, yes. Living and dying for one's principles.
All right, let's move on to Plato himself. Russell speaks of his enduring influence, like a peak of peculiar brightness.
It's a great image, contrasting the fleeting nature of politics with the lasting impact of thinkers like Plato. He notes how Plato deeply influenced early Christian thought, while Aristotle dominated the medieval period and Plutarch resonated later during the Renaissance. They cast long shadows.
And the core of Plato's philosophy, the theory of forms or ideas, how does Russell explain it?
He uses the example of common nouns, like bed. When we use the word, Plato argues, we're referring implicitly to the perfect form of bed. There's one ideal bed, perhaps made by God, and all the physical beds made by carpenters are just imperfect copies, participating in that form.
So true knowledge isn't through our senses.
No, the senses only perceive the imperfect copies. True knowledge comes through reason, apprehending the eternal, unchanging forms themselves. This leads, Russell suggests, to a kind of philosophical detachment from everyday affairs. The philosopher's focus is on this higher reality.
Did Plato mention qualities needed to become a philosopher?
Yes, Russell notes Plato looked for youths with a love of learning, good memory, harmonious nature, a sense of justice and gentleness.
What about Socrates accepting death? Plato gives reasons in the dialogues.
Several reasons. Respect for Athenian law is one. But also, Socrates mentions his divine sign, that inner voice that warned him against doing wrong but was silent about escaping. Russell also connects it to that Orphic idea, the body as a prison for the soul. You can't rightfully break out until the divine summons you.
And Socrates believed he was going somewhere better.
Yes, he expresses confidence he'll join wise gods and good people in the afterlife, a hopeful view.
This ties into the broader Platonic idea of separating soul from body.
Right. The philosophical pursuit is partly about purifying the soul, detaching it from bodily concerns. Russell contrasts this with the common view of life being about bodily pleasure.
Though Russell points out, Plato perhaps accidentally acknowledges that even base pleasures like envy or love of power are mental, not purely physical.
That's a neat observation. It complicates the simple mind-body split. Even lower desires can have a strong mental component.
Russell also tracks influences on Plato. Heraclitus initially.
Yes, the idea of flux seems present in Plato's early thought, that knowledge is of what becomes, not of what is. But this raised problems, especially with relational terms like tall or short, which depend on comparison. How can knowledge be stable if everything is changing?
But later, Plato leaned more towards Parmenides.
Russell notes a growing reverence for Parmenides and his static, unchanging reality later in Plato's career, a shift away from pure flux.
How did Plato view numbers?
As forms. Russell explains that 2 isn't just a property of 2 apples, like their redness might be. 2 refers to the abstract form of two-ness itself. It's a formal concept existing in that eternal realm, unlike contingent things like, well, George Washington again.
So mathematical truths are grasped by reason, not senses.
Exactly, a key part of his rationalism.
And Protagoras' man is the measure of all things. How does Russell handle that relativism?
By distinguishing between perception and inference. Your individual perception, how something looks or feels to you, is private, subjective. Protagoras might be right there, but inferences, the conclusions we draw, can be shared, debated, tested. That allows for objective knowledge beyond individual sensation.
A crucial distinction.
Very. Finally, on Plato's Politics in the Republic, Russell explains justice as everyone doing their proper job.
But who decides the job?
Not birth, Plato says, but aptitude, judged by the state, by the philosopher rulers. Russell points out the potential issue here. The state could deem even skilled work, like poetry, as harmful if it doesn't fit the ruler's philosophy.
And the rulers themselves.
They are philosophers who have grasped the forms, the eternal truths. Russell implies this means they'd essentially always agree with Plato, allowing little room for innovation or dissent. It's an ordered but potentially rigid society.
Raises questions about freedom, doesn't it?
Big questions, yes. It's a vision aiming for harmony, but perhaps at the cost of individual liberty.
Okay, let's transition to Plato's star pupil, Aristotle.
Russell sees him as different from Plato.
Different, yes. Russell considers Plato superior in imaginative genius, maybe, but sees Aristotle as far above anyone else in his systematic approach and sheer breadth. Despite their differences, Russell notes they shared a basic piety, believing the gods are good and should be worshipped.
Aristotle's key concepts: form and matter. How does Russell illustrate this?
He uses simple examples. A marble statue, marble is matter, the shape is form, or a bronze sphere, bronze is matter, sphericity is form. It seems common sense, but Aristotle's form is deeper than just shape. It's the essence, the defining principle, what makes a thing what it is.
But unlike Plato's forms, Aristotle's forms are in the things themselves, immanent, not in some separate abstract realm. That's a major difference.
And Aristotle classified substances
into 3 kinds, Russell explains. First, sensible and perishable things, plants, animals. They exist, we sense them, they decay. Second, sensible but eternal things for Aristotle. These were the heavenly bodies, the stars and planets. He thought they were unchanging. Third, things neither sensible nor perishable, the rational soul in humans, and ultimately, God, pure intellect.
What about Aristotle's argument for God, the first cause?
That's his main argument, the unmoved mover. Everything in motion needs a mover. You can't have an infinite chain of movers, so there must be a first mover, itself unmoved. This is God, eternal, unchanging substance, pure actuality, pure thought.
How does this God cause motion?
Interestingly, not by pushing or pulling, but by being loved, by being the ultimate object of desire and aspiration for the universe. The cosmos moves out of a desire to emulate God's perfection.
On thinking about itself.
That's Aristotle's description, a very intellectual, detached concept of the divine compared to later ideas.
What about his ethics and politics? The good of the individual versus the state.
Russell touches on this. Is the social good just the sum of individual goods, or something more, belonging to the whole community, like the health of a body versus its organs? Russell notes some later German philosophers really emphasize the collective, but suggests Aristotle's view in the Ethics and Politics is more focused on the flourishing of citizens within a good state.
Humans as political animals.
Exactly. Our potential is fulfilled within the polis, the community. Individual and state good are intertwined for Aristotle.
But Russell also tackles the problematic aspects of Aristotle's politics.
Yes, he doesn't ignore the justifications for slavery or the subordination of women. Aristotle believed in natural hierarchies. Some are naturally rulers, some naturally ruled.
Views incompatible with modern ethics.
Absolutely. But Russell also credits Aristotle with insightful political analysis, like his observation that revolutions often stem from perceived inequality, not just poverty.
And Aristotle's classification of governments.
The famous six-fold scheme. 3 good forms: rule by one, few or many for the common good. Monarchy, aristocracy, constitutional government, or polity. And their 3 corrupt forms: rule for self-interest, tyranny, oligarchy, democracy, which for Aristotle often meant mob rule. Russell notes Aristotle favored polity, a mixed constitution, believing moderate competence and virtue were most likely found in a broad middle class.
We should also mention his logic.
Crucial, the syllogism. Aristotle basically invented formal logic, providing a framework for deductive reasoning that dominated for over 2,000 years.
Finally, Russell offers a critique of the whole idea of substance.
Yes, he suggests it might be more of a linguistic habit than a deep metaphysical truth. We use nouns like Socrates, so we think of Socrates as a solid, enduring thing, separate from the events of his life.
But maybe Socrates is just the collection of events.
That's Russell's suggestion, questioning if there's an underlying substance beyond the attributes and occurrences. It challenges our basic intuition about what it means for something or someone to be.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to math and astronomy in ancient Greece.
Important developments there, too. Russell mentions antiphon, approximating pi.
Using polygons inside and outside a circle.
That's the method, squeezing the circle between polygons with more and more sides to get closer to the true value. Clever geometry.
And then Euclid's elements. Monumental.
Absolutely foundational. Russell praises its logical rigor, the axiomatic structure, its treatment of parallels, the theory of proportion from Eudoxus, handling irrationals, geometrical algebra, the study of regular solids perfected by Theaetetus.
Which Plato used in the Timaeus.
Exactly. Euclid's work was the geometry textbook for centuries, shaping how people thought mathematically and logically.
What about astronomy? Any breakthroughs Russell highlights?
Several key ones. Inopides discovering the tilt of the Earth's axis relative to its orbit, the obliquity of the ecliptic. The realization that the sun is much bigger than the Earth, a big step away from geocentrism. Rejecting earlier ideas like a central fire or a counter-Earth.
And Heracles of Pontus.
A really important figure. Russell notes he proposed that Venus and Mercury orbit the sun, not the Earth. And even more radically, that the Earth rotates on its axis daily.
A huge insight.
Revolutionary. Though Russell mentions Heracles didn't get quite the recognition you might expect. Sometimes great ideas take time to catch on.
Right, so that brings us to the Hellenistic period, after Alexander the Great.
Yes, Alexander's conquests spread Greek language and culture Hellenization far and wide. Syria, Asia Minor.
Though Russell notes the Jews largely resisted assimilation.
They maintained their distinct identity, yes, a notable exception.
And philosophically, this era saw a shift.
A definite shift. With the old city-states gone, absorbed into large empires, philosophy turned inward. Less focus on creating the ideal state, more on individual virtue, finding peace, how to live a good life in a world that might seem chaotic or corrupt.
More subjective, more individualistic.
That's the trend Russell identifies, continuing until Christianity offered a different kind of framework.
He discusses cynicism first, Antisthenes and Diogenes.
Right. Antisthenes advocating a return to nature, rejecting government, property, marriage, conventional religion. Diogenes took it further, the famous radical living in a tub, deliberately flouting conventions, defacing the coinage, as he put it.
A very provocative stance.
Challenging societal norms head-on, advocating extreme simplicity and self-sufficiency.
That Epicureanism, often misunderstood.
Very often. Russell clarifies it's not just about pursuing any old pleasure. He calls it a valetudinarian's philosophy, aimed at minimizing pain and achieving tranquility, ataraxia.
Through simple living, avoiding fear.
Exactly. Fear of death, fear of the gods. These were major sources of suffering Epicurus wanted to eliminate. Russell actually portrays Epicurus as quite earnest, almost a religious reformer, with his community being a kind of holy body seeking peace of mind.
And Stoicism, another major school.
Hugely influential, emphasis on virtue as the only good, living according to nature and reason, endurance, self-control. Russell mentions internal debates, like whether the soul survives death, Cleanthes versus Chrysippus.
Chrysippus also worked on logic and grammar.
Yes, significant contributions there. And later Stoics like Panetius and Posidonius modified the system, incorporating elements from Platonism, for instance. Stoicism had a long and evolving history.
Okay, finally, we arrive at the rise of Christianity in this period. Russell sees it drawing from many sources.
A real synthesis, yes. Philosophical ideas from Plato, Neoplatonists, Stoics, morality and history from the Jews, ideas about salvation echoing Orphism and other mystery cults.
What specific Jewish elements does he highlight?
Several key ones. Strict monotheism, a sacred history with God acting in the world, a moral code of the Ten Commandments, prophecy, and the concept of a Messiah. Also, that strong Jewish sense of identity, being God's chosen people, even in adversity.
He mentioned the Septuagint.
The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Crucial for early Christians, as most didn't read Hebrew. Russell mentions its legendary origin, and later translations like Jerome's Vulgate and Latin became hugely important for the Western Church.
What about philosophical influences on early Christianity? Neoplatonism.
Very significant, particularly through Plotinus. Russell outlines the core ideas. The one, the ultimate source, nous, divine intellect, and soul. The idea of emanation reality flowing down from the one, and the view of the material world as beautiful, but less real, less good than the intellectual realm.
This resonated with Christian thinkers.
It provided a sophisticated framework for thinking about God's transcendence, the relationship between the spiritual and material, the soul's journey.
He discusses origin in this context.
Yes, an early church father whose ideas sometimes align closely with Plotinus, like God being incorporeal, souls pre-existing, universal salvation eventually. But Russell notes many of Origen's specific doctrines were later condemned as heresy. He pushed the boundaries.
Who were the really key figures in shaping the early church, according to Russell?
He spotlights St. Ambrose, important for church-state relations, asserting church authority, St. Jerome for the Latin Vulgate Bible and promoting monasticism, and especially St. Augustine. His theology became dominant in the West for centuries.
Augustine's understanding of evil.
Crucial. He rejected Manichaean dualism, evil as a separate force. For Augustine, evil isn't a thing in itself, but a lack of good stemming from the perversion of free will.
And his major work, The City of God.
Written after Rome was sacked, refuting pagan claims that abandoning the old gods caused it. Augustine develops a whole Christian philosophy of history contrasting the earthly city, driven by self-love, with the heavenly city of God, based on love of God. Russell notes Augustine's high regard for Plato, whose ideas influenced him greatly, alongside his critiques of materialism.
Russell also touches on the early church councils.
Briefly, yes. Councils like Ephesus and Chalcedon were vital for defining Orthodox doctrine, especially about the nature of Christ, settling on the formula of one person with two natures, divine and human. These were intense theological battles.
And the role of monasticism.
Hugely important. Russell mentions St. Benedict and his rule, creating stable communities that preserved learning and spiritual practice through turbulent times. He also covers the political side, Pope Gregory the Great dealing with emperors and barbarian kings, and the eventual split between the papacy and the Eastern Empire, leading to alliances with the Franks, like Pepin and Charlemagne, shaping medieval Europe.
Wow, we've really covered a huge span of history and thought there.
It's an immense journey Russell takes us on, even just in this early period.
Absolutely. We've only managed to scratch the surface of the richness in Bertrand Russell's history of Western philosophy, focusing on ancient Greece through early Christianity. From those first bold steps of the pre-Socratics, through the monumental systems of Plato and Aristotle, the individual focus of Hellenistic thought, right up to the philosophical currents feeding into Christian theology. These ideas truly laid the foundations for so much that followed in Western civilization. We really hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and maybe offered some connections you hadn't considered before. To explore these ideas in much greater depth and follow the story forward, we definitely recommend getting a copy of Russell's History of Western Philosophy. You can find a link in the description. And if you enjoyed this exploration, please do subscribe to Books and Bytes for more deep dives into influential texts. So a question maybe to leave you with. What aspects of this ancient philosophy still resonate most strongly today? Where do you see their echoes in our modern world? Something to ponder until next time.